Today we're going to be learning a new form of a weak verb. That is the first nun verbs. If we look at the most common first nun verbs, here is a quick list of some of the verbs that you would want to know. Natan, which means to give. Nakha, to means to hit or be hit. Nasa, it means to lift up. Nagad, to make known or tell. Nata, to turn, stretch. Nus, to flee. Nagra, touch, reach, or overtake. And nasa, to depart. These verbs are incredibly common, especially natan occurs all over the place in the Old Testament. This is why it's really important for you to really know how the first nun verbs conjugate in various ways. The first nun verbs in the Qal is regular, so we're not going to talk about that. So let's begin with the imperfect or yikto form. Remember, with imperfect or yikto form, those are a prefix conjugation, meaning you're going to add a consonant before the verb. When this happens, when you add a prefix to a first nun verb, the first nun assimilates into the following consonantal letter. Assimilates means it doesn't simply disappear, okay? Assimilates mean it becomes part of the second radical letter. And there's evidence that this happened because if you pay careful attention, let's look at the verb nafal, for example. That means to fall. In its Qal imperfect third masculine singular form, that is with a yod prefix, it's written as yi pol. Can you see that dagesh in the second radical letter, or the pei? That dagesh is evidence that once upon a time there was a nun, and that dagesh is the mark that the nun has become one with that letter. So that's going to be the key to note. When there's a prefix letter, the first nun usually will assimilate to the second radical letter. There's an exception to this rule. Remember about guttural letters? There's one rule about guttural letters that applies in our instance. That is, the guttural rejects the dagesh forte. So, in verbs, whereas the second radical letter is a guttural and it's a first nun verb, it cannot assimilate into the second radical letter because the guttural letter will reject doubling. In these instances, it is important to note that the nun stays. So let's use the verb nahag as an example. Nahag means to guide or to lead. The second radical letter, hey, is a guttural. Because of this, we already know that even in its imperfect or yikto form, the first nun cannot assimilate into the second radical letter and becomes a dagesh. This is why, in these instances, the nun will remain, and we have yin hag as an example. So now let's see how the first nun verbs appear in imperative and infinitive construct form. It's a little bit complicated, so let's go step by step. For some verbs, there's actually no change. The nun will simply stay there, and this is especially the case when there are some form of weak letter in the second or third radical letter. Well, the example that you see in your table is the verb nafal, it means to fall. However, the nun often drops off when it's in the imperatival form. Remember, imperatival forms, even with the vowel point, indicates that it is a rushed or shortened form. So let's take the verb natan, to give, as an example, because it is the most commonly occurring first nun verb in all of the Old Testament. Natan in the imperative second masculine singular form is written as 10. You're going to look at that verb and say, I only see 2 letters. Where is the first letter? Well, remember that first nun verbs loses its nun when it's in the imperatival form. That's why if you look at the table here, you're going to see that Natan's imperatival form all lack the first nun. In the second masculine singular, it's 10. In the second masculine plural form is tenu. Second feminine singular form, teni. And second feminine plural form, tena. None of the forms has the initial nun. The verb natan in its infinitive construct form is really tricky. This is because you only see one of its 3 original root letters. Because, just as in the case with imperatives, the first nun drops off. But not only that, the third nun of Natan is replaced with a tav. Because of this, the form of Natan in the infinitive construct is tet. The initial tav is the only remaining letter of its triliteral root. The nun has dropped off, and the third nun is replaced with a different tav. There's one verb that I have to bring to your attention at this point. That is the verb lakach. The verb lakach means to take. Well, the verb lakach is clear that the initial letter is a lamed. However, even though the initial letter is a lamed, it acts like a first nun. Let me explain what I mean by that. Lakach in its imperatival form, for example, would lose its lamed. That is, the first letter drops off. This is also the case with prefix conjugations. When there's a letter prefixed to lakach, lamed disappears.